This is some of my most exciting stuff. We don't have a whole lot of time, but we've got enough time. So the livestock revolution is something in particular. And this is what really motivated me to get into this field. Again, in the late 90s, this is when this concept was coined by the International Food Policy Research Institute and their Livestock to 2020 report. There's screaming about it. Oh, sound the alarm, sound the alarm. We've got this massive meat crisis, this massive global consumption of meat happening. What are we going to do? It's going to have all these negative environmental consequences and food security consequences. And here's what the livestock revolution is something very in particular. And what it is it's increasing meat consumption, particularly among emerging economies, and that's lower and middle income countries that are becoming better off financially. And pretty much is a consistent trend when poor countries get more money, they start eating more animal products, and that's a pretty consistent trend. So you've got about half the world's population, even though I showed you about half the world's population is hungry, as they get a little bit better off, they eat more animal products. And then you've got the relatively high birth rates. So you've got a large population base with relatively high birth rates eating more resource-intensive animal products. And again, that focus is on low and middle income countries, and that's why I'm going to talk about the blame game a little bit. This is showing you population growth, and this is the blue is developing countries. I don't really like these words, but that's the words they're using, and that's words commonly used. The blue is developing countries, and red is developed countries. So that's basically the high income countries are in the blue, and the lower and middle income countries, the high income countries are in the red, and the lower middle income countries are in the blue. So you can see, why it's easy to blame, if you're going to use a chart like this, these lower and middle income countries having all these babies and causing all these problems, but they don't talk about the consumption in the high income countries, which is much greater. This is another chart. I don't think this is quite to scale, but it still gives you an idea about the population growth, which is in blue, and meat consumption, which is in red. So you can see where the 2000 to 2050, from 1950 to 2050, it's quite high. It's continuing to be high between 20,000 and 2050, but then meat consumption is skyrocketing. Again, I feel like this chart's not quite to scale, but it does show the basic idea around it. And we talked a little bit yesterday. I told you I was going to talk about China, and this is really important. Again, I'll slow it down a little bit. I know I start going through these concepts quickly, but there's a lot of focus on China and the problems that China is causing with their rapid increases in meat consumption. And when you look at this chart, it does look pretty bad. So around 1990, China matched the US, and now they have skyrocketed past the US, and they currently eat about twice as much meat as the US. And we just talked about some of the devastating impacts of meat consumption on the environment, on global resources, on global food security. But here's another look at that chart. It's not that chart, it's a different chart, but it's the same idea, except now China's at the bottom, and the US is at the top. And that's because this chart talks about per capita consumption. So the other one was aggregate, which is total, the total for the country. This one is per person. So we have no moral authority to talk to China and tell China they're hurting the world's crop prices and food, causing food insecurity and hurting the environment, because we still eat twice as much meat per person as China. China's population is 4 times greater than ours. That's why they're eating twice as much meat. But we are eating twice as much meat per person. And I'm going to show... Oh, no, don't look. My battery. All right, I'm going to do this manually. There we go. All right, we'll go manual on this. All right, so the deceptive focus on growth. So again, when you focus on growth, you've got to be really mindful. When you hear some of these key words, like focusing on change, focusing on growth, be mindful that there's a whole backstory that's not being covered when you're focusing on that. And also that terms like growth are much easier to get big numbers when you have low starting numbers. So if I have 2 and I jump to 4, that's double. But if I was 10, it's a lot harder to double because I'd have to go to 20. So with this focus here, we're going to talk about, say that the US is eating 10 units of meat, and that's about right because of the 70 billion land animals that the US consumes. We were right at 10 billion, and then we dropped a little bit to 9 billion. Thank you. Let's see if this works. So we were around 10 billion. We had to drop to in the 9 billions. It wasn't even just 9 billion, but in the 9 billions. And we were celebrating, hey, look at us. Look, we've reduced our meat consumption. Very proud of ourselves. And at the same time scolding China for doubling their meat consumption, but they had really low meat consumption. It was mostly a side dish or a condiment or just a few people within the population who could afford it. So their meat consumption at the national level was pretty low. They have been working as a national policy to increase meat consumption, but they have doubled, and we were all upset about it, but them doubling it only brings it to 4 units. Us decreasing by 10 brings us to 9. So we're still, again, per person, more than double what China is eating. So again, just mindful of the blame game. A lot of these think tanks and research are coming from the US and other high-income countries that are friendly to the US, and it's very convenient for us to have these things framed in ways that are blaming other countries. And again, the US has no moral authority if we're trying to get countries to reduce their meat consumption or be mindful if our consumption is so high. And how high is it? Well, this is how high it is. So this is showing the concentration of meat per capita. And as you can see, the US is right up there, Australia is right up there, Europe, some areas in South America, Africa, one of the lowest meat consumers in the world. India, the lowest meat consumer in the world. But again, India's got about 1.3 billion people, coming up on 1.3 billion, and they are increasing their meat consumption. And one of the things, so if you think China has a unit of 2, if India has a unit of 1, it doesn't take much for India's meat consumption to double, triple, quadruple. It's really easy to do. Meat consumption is on the incline. In India, it's considered modern. So in the US, where young people are more likely to become vegan, in India, young people are more likely to eat meat because it's associated with modern and coolness and power and things like that. So it does make a big difference, but who are we to tell India not to eat so much meat? This is another way. So I just got a couple charts just showing meat disparities in different ways. High-income countries are in red, low-income countries are in blue. That green is the average. This is the top 10 per capita meat countries in the world. And let me just tell you how mad I am that Luxembourg is at the top, because it's ruining my talking point. I want to be up here and I was like, the US eats more meat than all the world. We're the number one. We're number one. We eat more meat than everybody in the world. And this is from The Economist, and they put Luxembourg at the top. Luxembourg is not the world's largest meat eater. You might not even know what Luxembourg is. You might think it's a city in Germany, but it's not. It's its own little tiny country that is near Germany and France and Belgium. And they have a lot of commuters from those countries coming in and working and eating. And so all of Luxembourg's numbers are always skewed. Their smoking numbers, anything consumption, their soda, meat. They do not eat more meat than the US. We are number one. Sometimes Australia might beat us, but it's a competition between Australia and the United States. But in this case, we are number one, and you can see India is last, and China's in the middle. So again, as we're blaming China, look how low they are relative to the US. This is the number of land animals killed for food. Again, like I said, we want to talk about numbers a little bit. I'm not going to stay focused too much here, but we are exceeding 70 billion. When I first started this work in the late 90s, around 2000, we were at 50 billion land animals killed per year for food. And I thought, we can't double. There's no way. We don't have the resources. But we are on track for that. So 70 billion land animals, just over 9 billion, starting to push back up on 10 billion in the US. And if we break that down, because I work with the numbers and I can't get my head around the numbers, it's 1 million per hour. And that's where I wanted to contrast that with the number of humans dying per hour of hunger and hunger-related causes, is that we have 1,000 people dying and 1 million animals dying every hour in our broken food system. And this is unnecessary. It'd be different if it's like, well, we have to. We don't have to eat meat. We don't have to have animal products. These animals do not need to be dying. And these people do not need to be dying. Again, veganism will not cure world hunger, but it's a contributor. So that's why I have the slide here, just to bring in some of the numbers. This is another one showing some of the meat growth. Again, in 2000, it was about 50 billion animals, and that was 225,000 metric tons. This is showing our increase. You see I specifically labeled 2015 numbers because that's about when those statistics last came out. We don't have 2016 yet. Just over 70 billion, and the prediction is to go to 450,000 metric tons. And as Tony Weiss told us yesterday, that was 120 billion animals. I actually didn't know how many animals because it's hard to tell how many animals when you know the weight because it depends on the distribution of pigs versus chickens versus cows. So I didn't know actually the number of animals, but Tony Weiss said yesterday, and I believe him, that it's 120 billion animals if the current trends continue. Now, personally, I actually don't think we're going to make it to 2050 with these numbers because the climate crisis is going to come in and start wiping out livestock production and the economic system. So unfortunately, I would love for us to change our habits and not have the system taken out by environmental destruction, but I don't think it's going to work that way. Also, if you hear numbers, you'll hear that to meet growing food demand is 70%. So we're predicted to have 9 billion plus people in 2050, about a 30% or more growth, depending on which numbers you hear. If it's 9 billion, it's about 30%. So why would we need 70% more food to feed 30% more people? And it's because they are including meat consumption. So we need to grow 70% more crops because a lot of those crops are going to be going into meat consumption. And if you're wondering how was meat consumption happening and hunger's happening at the same time, it's because of the increasing disparities. So one of the things I didn't mention earlier, because like I said, we're moving a little fast through these slides, is that in the areas where hunger has declined, that's not even. So a lot of countries in Asia have had a decline in global hunger, and so that they're over that mark. But in sub-Saharan Africa in particular, there was an increase in hunger. So what you're having is more disparities, and that's why there's increasing meat consumption, but still increasing hunger, and that's just going to continue to get worse. And if anything I'm going to credit for what I am doing today, this is from that report that I've mentioned a couple times. And one of the big focus they had was that meat is demand driven. And it was really, weird to see this report going on and on about the Livestock Revolution and all the problems it was going to cause. And then they had this one particular quote that says, "It is unwise to think that the Livestock Revolution will somehow go away in response to moral suasion by well-meaning development partners." I was like, wait, that's me. But I'm really struck by this. They act as if demand is a given. Demand is not a given. It's a social construct. Our pricing system, our subsidy systems are all creating this demand. So they act like that demand is just given because people want more meat as they have more money. But why is that, and how are we supporting that? And instead, let's be shifting those policies and those subsidies to counteract that demand, not just take it as a given. So what the leadership response wants to do is they're saying, okay, we have this growing population, eating more meat, we need to have 70% more crops. How are we going to do that? And so their choice is to increase yield, and they want to do that with technology, fertilizers, the new green revolution, factory farming, getting more efficiencies in their meat production by being able to grow animals bigger and faster. And then they also want to do that by controlling demand. And instead of controlling demand by swapping meat and diet choices, they want to focus on population control. And there's all kinds of problems with population control. I wish I could get into some of the history around that. But first off, I have the target here in particular because if you're talking about population control, You're looking to look at Africa and Asia is where they're pointing the finger at, because that's where the high birth rates are happening. Again, a lot of racial and ethnic biases and where the focus is. And then again, also gender biases, because when you're talking about population control, you're talking about controlling women's bodies. And if you're concerned about population control, you need to give women access to power and to schooling and to birth control and things of that nature, to give them control over their body and cultural control as well. So if you want to reduce birth rates, those are the types of things you need to do. But that's not the kind of stuff they really talk about. But they ignore meat consumption. The most common sense thing that they should be talking about is reducing meat consumption, and that's what they ignore. That's the easiest. It's easier to get people to stop eating meat than to try to have people who are not even in your own country to stop having babies. It's easier than trying to pull some magic wand with the technology. Eat less meat, eat no meat, less cheese, less eggs. So again, we're a vegan organization. A Well-Fed World is a vegan organization. That's what we want. My cheerleader. My mom's over there. You're the cheerleader. Hi, Mom. But you got to focus on the meat consumption now. Oh, vegan. We're a vegan organization. But we do support incremental change as a way to be accessible, because we want people, if we get mass incremental change, it's going to make a difference and help make it easier for other people. So, we do support that, but we want you to go as far as you can. So we talk about minimizing meat consumption, ideally eliminating. So the more you do, the better. So don't be scared off. Don't think it's all or nothing, but do work your way towards it if you can. And so that was my response to that. That's me. It's a selfie. I was really mad at that report, but it is literally what inspired me to do this work, because I was planning to work at the World Bank and work on poverty issues. And when I started reading these research reports that were not even addressing diet change in the U.S. and other high-income countries, I knew I would just be a cog in the wheel. And so then I shifted my focus to being an advocate on meat consumption in particular and its impact on hunger. And there were very few people at the time doing it. There's still very few people doing it, but it's getting a little more attention. More on the aggregate versus per capita. So again, population is important. I'm not saying population issues aren't important, but there's a blame game going on, and anytime we talk about it, I'm just driving that point home. We have to focus also on consumption, or we're being too convenient for us and deceptive. Circles of Compassion by Will Tuttle is an anthology, and my essay in here, we got a fan. Hunger, Meat, and the Banality of Evil actually does go into some of the numbers. So despite the title just kind of being like a theoretical title, I do go into the numbers as well. I only have 2 copies here, but you can also get it online. The takeaway points: meat is going to double over 50 years. Again, you'll have different numbers. Sometimes people say meat is going to double, and what, from now till 2050? So sometimes they say over 20 years. So anyway, the numbers I've seen are from 20 to 2050. Meat is a social construct. It's not a given. They'll say it's demand-driven. Don't believe it. There's things we can do to change it. And then again, we need to balance technology and population concerns with consumption change.